I used to count the silences between us. At first, they were comfortable, the kind that fall softly between two people who don't need words to understand each other. But somewhere along the way, those silences grew teeth. I remember the exact moment when I first noticed it, standing in our kitchen on a Tuesday evening, the sound of James chopping vegetables the only noise filling our apartment. I just told him about my promotion, and he'd smiled, nodded, and continued slicing carrots as if I'd merely commented on the weather. "Did you hear what I said?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Of course, Ellie. Congratulations." His eyes never left the cutting board. "We should celebrate this weekend." We never did celebrate. That weekend came and went like so many others. James working late, coming home with his cologne masked by something sharper, something foreign. I told myself it was just the restaurant smells from client dinners. I was good at telling myself things back then. We'd met 7 years earlier at a friend's gallery opening. He was charming, accomplished, and looked at me like I was the only artwork worth seeing that night. Our courtship was a whirlwind of weekend getaways, long conversations about books we loved, and promises whispered against warm skin. I fell hard and fast. We married within a year. The first 3 years were good, genuinely good. We bought our Brooklyn apartment, painted the walls ourselves, made love on drop cloths surrounded by empty paint cans. We talked about having children someday, a conversation that always ended with James kissing my forehead and saying, "Just us for now. Is that okay?" And it was, until it wasn't. Year 4, James's investment firm took off. Suddenly our calendar was filled with networking events and client dinners I wasn't invited to. "It's just business, Elle," he'd say, straightening his tie in the mirror, not seeing how my reflection behind him was becoming transparent. "You'd be bored anyway." By year 5, I'd mastered the art of not asking questions. "Where have you been? Why didn't you call? Who is she?" The questions formed like storm clouds in my mind, but dissolved on my tongue. I focused instead on my career in publishing, my friends, my running routine, building a life that could stand on its own when James wasn't there to notice it. The text messages started in year 6. I found the first one accidentally when his phone lit up beside me on the couch. James was in the shower, and I glimpsed the preview. "Last night was amazing. When can I see you again?" Her name was Rebecca. The contact had no last name. I put the phone down and sat motionless, my heart oddly calm in my chest. I didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, I began cataloging the evidence. Late nights, weekend emergencies at work, the gradual disappearance of his affection. It wasn't just Rebecca. There were others. A woman named Sophia who called when he was in the shower. And Emily who sent an earring and a small package to our home with a note saying he'd left it at her place. Each discovery should have broken me, but instead, they just confirmed what the silences had been telling me all along. At night, I'd lie awake beside him, listening to his breathing, wondering who he was dreaming about. Sometimes, I'd reach over and place my palm lightly on his chest, just to feel his heartbeat, to remind myself that underneath his betrayal, he was still human, still mortal. Sometimes, in those quiet moments, I hated him so much it felt like love again, both emotions burning with the same intensity. 7 years in, I stopped counting the silences. They had become the primary language of our marriage, a dictionary of things unsaid, truths unacknowledged. I lived in the in-between spaces of his life, arranging dinner parties for his colleagues, where I played the role of devoted wife, smiling until my face ached, pretending I didn't see the glances between him and his assistant. I became very good at pretending, so good that sometimes I almost fooled myself. It happened on our anniversary. 7 years, which should have meant something. I'd planned everything meticulously, made a reservation at Carlisle's, the restaurant where he proposed, bought a new dress in deep emerald that made my eyes look the color of spring leaves, even scheduled a blowout at that expensive salon he once mentioned liking. James had promised to be home by 6. At 7:30, I was still sitting on our bed, fully dressed, staring at my phone. No messages, no calls. I sent a text. "Everything okay?" It showed as read immediately, but no reply came. At 8, I called his office. The security guard answered, said everyone had left hours ago. I thanked him and hung up, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. By 9, I had removed my makeup and changed into pajamas. The dress hung from the bathroom door like a deflated version of the woman I'd tried to be. I ordered Thai food, poured myself a generous glass of wine, and settled on the couch with a book I couldn't focus on. When the door finally opened at 11:42 p.m., James looked surprised to see me awake. "You're still up," he said, loosening his tie. There was lipstick on his collar, not even hidden well, a bright crimson that looked like an open wound against the white fabric. "It's our anniversary," I said quietly. His face fell, a quick calculation happening behind his eyes before he covered it with remorse. I'm so sorry. The Wilson account, we had to take them out. I completely forgot." I nodded, taking a sip of wine. The Wilson account. It was an emergency meeting. You know how it is. He set his briefcase down, came toward me like he might kiss my forehead, that patronizing kiss that had become his signature over the years. I moved away. "There's lipstick on your collar." His hand went to his neck automatically, fingers brushing against the evidence. "That's not... Please don't." My voice was so calm it surprised even me. "Just don't lie to me tonight." James stood there, frozen between approaches. Deny everything or minimize it. I could see the debate playing out on his face. He opted for minimizing. It was just drinks. Nothing happened. I laughed then, a sound so hollow it echoed in our living room. Nothing happened. Nothing ever happens, right, James? Just like nothing happened with Rebecca? Or Sophia? Or your assistant? His eyes widened. You knew. I've always known. I set my glass down and stood up. I think I've been waiting for you to respect me enough to either end it or at least admit it. He ran his hand through his hair. That gesture I used to find endearing. Now it just looked like a rehearsed move in a performance I was tired of watching. Ella, it's complicated. You and we've been distant. You have to admit that. No, I said, and the word felt clean and sharp on my tongue. I don't have to admit anything. The distance was your creation, not mine. I've been right here, all along. James loosened his tie further, a flush rising up his neck. Look, I've had a long day. Can we talk about this tomorrow when we're both calmer? That was when something finally broke inside me. A dam holding back 7 years of silent rage. There won't be a tomorrow for this conversation, James. I'm done. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in years. Maybe he was. What does that mean? I walked to the hall closet and pulled out the suitcase I had packed that morning, a decision I hadn't even acknowledged to myself until that moment. It means I've spent 7 years of my life waiting for you to see me, to choose me. I'm not waiting anymore. You're leaving? Just like that? His voice held more indignation than pain. Where will you even go? To Megan's. My sister had been offering her guest room for over a year. Don't worry. I won't tell anyone about your indiscretions. Your reputation will remain intact. He stepped toward me, his face softening into the expression he used when he wanted to charm someone. Ellie, baby, let's not be hasty. We can work through this. Couples therapy, maybe? I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I felt nothing. Not anger, not heartbreak, not even disappointment anymore. Just a vast, peaceful emptiness. The irony is, I would have forgiven you. Many times I almost said something, hoping we could fix it. But you never gave me the chance. You never respected me enough to even acknowledge what you were doing. That's not fair, he said, his charm giving way to defensiveness. I've always respected you. I picked up my suitcase. Respect isn't just about saying the right things, James. It's about how you treat someone when you think no one is watching. I was watching. I always was. Megan's guest room became my sanctuary. The first week I barely left it, emerging only for coffee and the occasional toast that my sister would insist I eat. She didn't ask questions, just sat with me in a silence that felt nothing like the ones I'd left behind. This silence was patient, healing. He's called again, she said on day 9, handing me a mug of tea. That's 15 times now. I nodded, wrapping my fingers around the warmth. I know. You don't have to talk to him. I know that too. I looked out her kitchen window at the small garden below, where spring was cautiously announcing itself in tiny green buds. But eventually, I'll have to figure out what comes next. What came next was paperwork. divorce filings, division of assets, the cold, clinical dismantling of 7 years, reduced to signatures and inventory lists. James fought it at first, not because he wanted me back, but because divorce didn't fit the image he'd crafted for himself, the successful businessman with the perfect marriage. My leaving was an inconvenient crack in the facade. He showed up at Megan's unannounced one evening, 3 weeks after I'd left. I was alone. Megan was on a date. When I opened the door, he looked smaller somehow, less certain than I'd ever seen him. "You need to come home," he said, no preamble. "That's not my home anymore." I didn't invite him in. "I've been thinking about what you said." He shifted uncomfortably. "About respect. You're right. I didn't respect what we had. But I want to try again. I've ended things with..." He trailed off. "With who? Rebecca? Sophia? Your assistant? All of them?" I wasn't being cruel. I genuinely wanted to know which betrayal he thought was the one that mattered. He looked down. "It doesn't matter. They're all in the past. I want to focus on us. There is no us, James." The truth of those words settled into my bones as I spoke them. "There hasn't been for a long time. We have history," he insisted. 7 years. Most of which you spent looking over my shoulder for something better. I leaned against the door frame, suddenly tired. "Do you even know who I am anymore? What books I'm reading? What keeps me up at night? What I hope for?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence between us now was different. Not the suffocating quiet of our marriage, but the stark clarity of truth. "I didn't think so," I said softly. "Go home, James. I've signed the papers." "You should too." After he left, I sat on Megan's balcony and cried. Not for the man who had just walked away, but for the woman who had stayed silent for so long. For the years I'd never get back. For the version of love I'd convinced myself was enough. In the months that followed, I rebuilt myself piece by piece. I found an apartment in a neighborhood I'd always loved, but James had deemed too artsy. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from, people who remembered the woman I was before I started shrinking to accommodate his ego. I transferred to another department at my publishing house, where I could work with debut authors, new voices finding their way to the page. The divorce was finalized in early autumn. My lawyer called with the news while I was painting my kitchen yellow, a color James had always hated. I thanked her, hung up, and continued painting, the brushstroke steady and sure. That evening, I walked to Prospect Park and sat on a bench, watching people pass by. Couples, families, solitary figures like myself. A woman about my age sat down beside me, unwrapping a sandwich. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, though she already had. Not at all. She took a bite, then offered me half. I always packed too much, force of habit from feeding my kids. I accepted it, oddly touched by the gesture. "Thank you." "Rough day?" she asked, noticing something in my expression. "Actually, no. My divorce was finalized today." She nodded, understanding without pity. "The beginning of something, then." "Yes," I said, and felt the truth of it bloom inside me. The beginning of something. We sat there, two strangers sharing a sandwich in the fading light of day. I didn't know her name, and she didn't know my story, but in that moment, I felt a connection I hadn't experienced in years, the simple acknowledgement of one human being to another. Walking home, I passed a bookstore with a help wanted sign in the window. On impulse, I went inside. The owner, an older woman with silver hair and ink-stained fingers, was shelving new arrivals. "I saw your sign," I said. "I work in publishing, but I've always wanted to be on this side of the counter too." She looked me over appraisingly. "Part-time only, pays terribly, but you get to talk about books all day and take home advanced reader copies." I smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like forever. "Sounds perfect." That night, I called Megan and told her about the bookstore job I'd be starting on weekends, alongside my publishing work. "2 jobs?" she asked, concerned. "Are you sure that's not too much?" "It's not about the money," I told her. "It's about filling my life with things I love." After we hung up, I sat on my fire escape with a glass of wine, watching the Brooklyn lights flicker against the darkening sky. For the first time in years, The silence around me felt like possibility rather than absence. I had no idea what came next, and that uncertainty felt strangely like freedom. Winter descended on Brooklyn with uncharacteristic gentleness that year. I settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own. Weekdays at the publishing house, weekends at the bookstore, and evenings filled with whatever I wanted. The novelty of that freedom was intoxicating at first, then terrifying, then finally, comforting. I joined a book club that met at the store after hours, found a yoga studio 3 blocks from my apartment, and started taking myself out to dinner once a week. Always sitting at the bar, always ordering dessert. "You look different," observed Nina, a debut author whose manuscript I was editing. We were having coffee in the small cafe near our office, discussing her revisions. "Different how?" I tucked my hair behind my ear, a nervous habit I hadn't quite broken. "More present," she said, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "When we first met 6 months ago, you seemed like you were always looking over your shoulder, waiting for something bad to happen. I considered this, remembering how I used to flinch when my phone rang, always expecting James with some crisis or accusation. I guess I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now I realize there is no other shoe." Nina smiled. "Freedom looks good on you." It was the first time anyone had described my divorce as freedom rather than failure, and something in me unfurled at her words. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and really looked at myself, the slight crinkles around my eyes, the freckles across my nose that James had always suggested I cover with foundation, the curve of my lips that now smiled more easily. I was 34 and starting over, but my face told a different story. Not of setback, but of survival. At the bookstore, I became known for my recommendations. I had an uncanny ability to match readers with their perfect next book, a skill my boss, Margaret, claimed was worth more than my meager salary could reflect. The truth was, I'd spent so many years studying people's reactions, trying to anticipate James's moods, that I'd become attuned to the subtlest shifts in expression, the things people said between their words. "You've got a gift," Margaret told me one Sunday evening as we closed up shop. "You listen to people. Really listen." I didn't always, I admitted, counting out the register. "I think I spent a lot of years not even listening to myself." Margaret, with her silver hair and decades of wisdom, just nodded. "Better late than never, sweet girl." As winter melted into spring, I started writing again, something I'd abandoned years before when James had called my short stories hobby writing and suggested I focus on more practical pursuits. At first, I wrote only for myself, early in the mornings before work, or late at night when the city quieted. Just fragments, scenes, character sketches. But gradually those fragments began to coalesce into something larger, something that felt important. I told no one about my writing, guarding it like a secret garden that was just beginning to bloom. It was mine alone, not subject to anyone's judgment or expectations. The words came easily some days and not at all on others, but I kept returning to the page, trusting that the story knew where it needed to go. In April, a pipe burst in my apartment building, forcing me to temporarily relocate. Without thinking, I called Megan, who immediately offered her couch, but then I hesitated, remembering how I'd leaned on her so heavily after leaving James. "Actually," I said, "I think I'll get a hotel room, just for a few days." "Are you sure?" "It's no trouble." "I'm sure," I told her, and heard the surprise in my own voice. "I want to." The hotel was nothing fancy, just a clean, modern room in downtown Brooklyn with a view of the water. But as I unpacked my emergency suitcase and arranged my toiletries in the pristine bathroom, I felt a surge of pride. 6 months ago, being alone in a hotel room would have felt like a punishment. Now it felt like an adventure. I ordered room service that night, a ridiculously overpriced burger and a glass of good red wine, and ate by the window, watching boats move across the harbor like slow-motion fireflies. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret asking if I was okay and needed anything. Then another from Nina sending me a funny meme about editors. Then one from my book club group chat discussing next month's selection. Looking at those messages, I realized I'd built something I hadn't even been conscious of creating, a life with connections that were chosen, not obligatory. People who saw me clearly and valued what they saw. I fell asleep that night with the curtains open, the city lights casting gentle shadows across the room, and dreamed of nothing at all. A dreamless, peaceful sleep that felt like blessing. I saw him on a Tuesday. I was leaving a lunch meeting with Nina, whose book was nearing its publication date, when I spotted James across the street. He was exiting a sleek office building, laughing with someone I didn't recognize. It had been almost 9 months since our divorce, and the sight of him didn't hurt the way I had expected it to. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing a character from a book I'd read long ago. He looked the same. Tailored suit, confident stride, that calculated charm evident even from a distance. But I could see it now for what it was, a performance. I wondered briefly if his companion could see it too, or if she was as captivated as I had once been. "Ellie?" Nina's voice pulled me back. "You okay?" I nodded, turning away from the scene across the street. "Yeah, just saw my ex-husband." "Oh." Nina looked over her shoulder, trying to spot him in the crowd. "Want to duck into this shop until he's gone?" The suggestion made me smile. "No," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "No, I don't need to hide." We continued walking, and I didn't look back to see if James had noticed me. It didn't matter anymore. That evening, I wrote more than I had in weeks, the words flowing with a clarity that felt like a gift. I wrote about a woman standing at a distance, seeing clearly for the first time. I wrote about the difference between loneliness and solitude. I wrote until my fingers cramped, and the sky outside my window deepened to indigo. 3 days later, I received an email from him. The subject line read simply, "Hope you're well." I stared at it for a long moment, cursor hovering over the delete button. But curiosity won out. "Ellie, I saw you the other day on Madison. You looked well, happy even. I was going to come over and say hello, but then thought better of it. Maybe you didn't see me, or maybe you did and chose not to acknowledge me, which would be fair. I've been doing some thinking since our last conversation. You were right about a lot of things, more than I was ready to admit at the time. I'm seeing someone now who's been encouraging me to be more honest. With her, with myself. It's harder than I expected. Anyway, I found some of your old journals when I was clearing out the storage unit. I thought you might want them back. Let me know where I can send them, or if you'd prefer I just get rid of them. Take care, James." I read the email twice, searching for the manipulative undertones I would have once found there. But it seemed genuinely benign. Not apologetic exactly, but not demanding either. The mention of my journals sent a jolt through me. I'd forgotten about them. Leather-bound notebooks filled with my earliest writing attempts, stored away when James had casually commented that keeping journals was a bit juvenile. I replied simply, "James, yes, I did see you. You can mail the journals to the publishing house. Address below. I hope you find what you're looking for. Ellie." The journals arrived a week later in a plain brown box. I opened them that evening, sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, a glass of wine beside me. Reading my younger self's words was like having a conversation with a ghost. So familiar, yet so distant. I'd been passionate, opinionated, full of dreams and observations about the world. When had I started silencing that voice? It hadn't happened all at once, I realized. It had been gradual. A concession here, a compromise there, until I'd forgotten the sound of my own thoughts. One entry from the early days of our relationship caught my attention. I'd written about a fight we'd had, our first real one, over something trivial. But even then, there had been warning signs I'd chosen to ignore. He apologized, but somehow I ended up being the one to say sorry first. I'm not even sure what I was apologizing for anymore, but he smiled at me afterward in that way that makes everything feel okay again. "Oh, honey," I whispered to my younger self. "You had no idea what was coming." I stayed up late into the night, reading through my past, witnessing the slow erosion of my confidence chronicled in my own handwriting. The final journal entry, dated about 3 years into our marriage, simply read, "I don't know who I am anymore when he's not in the room." After that, the pages were blank. I closed the last journal and sat in silence, letting the weight of what I'd read settle around me. Then I did something unexpected. I laughed. Not bitterly, but with genuine relief, because that lost woman who didn't recognize herself, she was gone, And in her place was someone who had fought her way back to the surface, someone who had reclaimed her voice word by word, day by day. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee, watching the sunrise paint my kitchen walls gold. I felt lighter somehow, as if reading those journals had exorcised the last lingering ghost of my marriage. I took out my laptop and opened the document I'd been working on for months. My novel, now nearly complete. The protagonist, a woman rebuilding her life after years of emotional manipulation, had always felt personal, but now I understood she wasn't just my past. She was the bridge to my future. I emailed James a brief thank you for returning the journals. He responded with just 2 words, "You're welcome." And that, I decided, was the perfect epilogue to our story. No drama, no unresolved feelings, just a simple acknowledgement and the freedom to move on. My novel was finished on a rainy Sunday in October, exactly 1 year after my divorce was finalized. I wrote the last sentence, then sat motionless at my kitchen table, listening to the gentle patter against the windows and feeling the curious emptiness that comes with completing something that has lived inside you for so long. I didn't celebrate right away. Instead, I closed my laptop, put on my raincoat, and went for a long walk through the glistening streets of Brooklyn, letting the accomplishment settle into my bones. I finished it, I told Margaret the next day at the bookstore, my voice hushed as if sharing a secret. Her eyes widened. "The novel? Your novel?" I nodded, arranging a display of new releases with careful hands. "I don't know if it's any good." "But it's done. Let me read it," she said immediately, no hesitation in her voice. "I've been doing this for 40 years, Ellie. I know what works and what doesn't. It's not ready for... Nothing is ever ready," she interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "You just have to be brave enough to let it go." So I did. I emailed her the manuscript that evening, then spent the next week in a state of nervous anticipation. I threw myself into work at the publishing house, took extra shifts at the bookstore, cleaned my apartment from top to bottom. Anything to keep from thinking about Margaret reading my words, judging my story. She called me on Saturday morning. "Come over," she said. No preamble. "We need to talk about this book." Her apartment was above the bookstore, a cozy space filled with more books than furniture, cats lounging on every available surface. She sat me down at her kitchen table, put a cup of tea in front of me, and looked me straight in the eye. "It's good, Ellie. Really good." I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. "You're not just saying that? Have you ever known me to say things I don't mean?" She smiled, sliding my manuscript across the table. It was marked with sticky notes and pencil annotations. "It needs work. All first drafts do. But the heart of it is there. And I think I know exactly who needs to read it." 3 weeks later, I was sitting across from Vanessa Chen, a senior editor at one of New York's most prestigious publishing houses, and not the one I worked for. Margaret had connections everywhere, it seemed, and had insisted this was the right home for my book. "I don't usually take meetings like this," Vanessa said, studying me over the rim of her coffee cup. "But Margaret doesn't recommend manuscripts often, and when she does, I pay attention." I nodded, trying to appear more confident than I felt. "I appreciate you taking the time." "I stayed up until 3 reading your novel," she continued, setting down her cup. "It's raw in places, maybe too raw, but there's an honesty to it that's compelling. The way you write about silence, the things that go unsaid in relationships, it resonated with me." My throat tightened. "Thank you. I'd like to acquire it," she said simply. "If you're interested." The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Yes, I'm interested." Vanessa smiled, the first real warmth she'd shown. "Good. Now, we need to talk about how you're going to handle working with a competing publisher. Because I assume you want to keep your day job?" I hadn't even considered that complication. "I should, probably. At least until I see if this book thing works out." "Smart," she nodded. "We'll be discreet. Use a pen name if necessary." Walking back to the subway after our meeting, I felt like I was floating slightly above the sidewalk. My phone buzzed with a text from Megan. How did it go? I called her instead of texting back. When she answered, I could barely get the words out. "They want to publish my book." Her scream of delight was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "I knew it! Ellie, this is huge! We need to celebrate!" We met that evening at her favorite restaurant, where she'd already ordered champagne by the time I arrived. Megan raised her glass, eyes shining. "To my brilliant sister, the soon-to-be published author." I clinked my glass against hers, happiness bubbling inside me like the champagne. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up. Not a dream," she assured me. "Just the life you deserve finally showing up." Later, as we shared dessert, Megan's expression grew more serious. "Have you thought about what happens when the book comes out? People will read it. James might read it." I'd considered this, of course. The novel wasn't exactly autobiographical, but there were elements of my experience woven throughout. Anyone who knew me well would recognize the parallels. "I'm not worried about it," I said, surprised to find I meant it. "It's my story to tell." "Yes," Megan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "It absolutely is." The months that followed were a whirlwind of edits, contract negotiations, and continuing to balance both my jobs while working on my book. I decided against a pen name, another small act of reclamation. This was my story, my voice, and I wanted to own it completely. When the advanced reader copies arrived in spring, I held the physical manifestation of my work with trembling hands. My name on the cover, my words inside. Margaret insisted on hosting a small pre-publication party at the bookstore, inviting local authors, booksellers, and a few close friends. "We're celebrating early," she announced to the gathered crowd, "because once this book hits shelves next month, our Ellie is going to be too busy with her book tour to remember us little people." Everyone laughed, and I felt my cheeks warm with pleased embarrassment. Looking around at the faces of my friends, Nina with her own published novel now, Margaret who had believed in me before I fully believed in myself, Megan who had given me shelter when I needed it most, I was overwhelmed by a sense of belonging. "I want to thank you all," I said, when Margaret handed me the microphone. "Especially those of you who were there during the harder chapters of my life." My voice caught slightly, but I pushed through. There's a line in my book about how we're all just stories in the end. But what matters most is who we choose to tell those stories with. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Nina pulled me aside. "I'm so proud of you," she said, hugging me tightly. "You've come full circle." And standing there in the bookstore that had become my sanctuary, surrounded by the community I'd built for myself, I knew she was right. The silent years were behind me. My voice, clear and strong and unmistakably mine, had finally found its way to the page, and more importantly, back to me.